he slapped me at his brother's wedding. Not in private, not in a quiet corner in the middle of the reception, in front of 200 people, with the string quartet still playing and my engagement ring still on my finger. I stood there for a moment with the sound ringing in my ears and the room frozen, and then I sat down on the marble floor because my legs decided before my brain did. The first person who reached me was not a bridesmaid. It was not a family friend. It was Vesper Crane, Declan's twin sister, the cold one who knelt on the floor in her tailored black suit and said, very quietly, "Get up. I've got you." If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I need to tell you who everyone was before I can tell you what happened that night. My name is Lyrian Moss. Everyone who knows me calls me Leary, 2 syllables, easy. The version my mother used when she was not worried about me, which in the past 2 weeks had stopped being most of the time. I was 28 years old, a senior editor at Ashwood Press, a woman who had spent 3 years building a life around a man who turned out to be a very different person in a ballroom than he was in private. I had met Declan Crane at a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 25, and he was charming and beautiful and laughed at exactly the right moments and made me feel, for the first time in years, like the most interesting person in the room. I had loved him the way you love things that appear designed for you fully and without examining the design for as long as the design holds. The engagement had happened 18 months earlier. The ring was a 3-stone diamond in a platinum setting that Declan had chosen without asking what I wanted, which should have been information I attended to more carefully. I had worn it every day since. I had planned a wedding in my head and in several meticulously organized spreadsheets. I had introduced him to my parents and my colleagues and my best friend Bex Tully, who had said, privately and exactly once, that he was very handsome and that she hoped I knew the difference between being chosen and being acquired. I had not known the difference. I was learning it now, on the marble floor of the Harcourt Hotel ballroom, with 200 of the Crane family's closest associates watching from behind their champagne flutes and the terrible mercy of event lighting. But before the floor, I have to tell you about Vesper. Vesper Crane was 32 years old, the same age as Declan, his twin, by 4 minutes. She was a corporate attorney and a partner at Crane Whitmore LLP, a firm she had joined at 24 and made partner at 31, which was the kind of timeline that required a complete reconstruction of what you understood the word dedication to mean. She was 4 minutes older than her twin, and had, in the way of certain elder siblings, regardless of the margin, been running the practical architecture of the Crane family since their father died 6 years ago. She managed the estate accounts. She reviewed the vendor contracts for every family event. She handled the things that required handling with the quiet, total efficiency of someone who had decided a long time ago that if she did not do it, it would not be done correctly. She was the cold one. That was how everyone in the Crane family's extended orbit described her, with the particular mixture of respect and slight wariness that people use when they are describing someone they both admire and are relieved not to be in an argument with. Declan's warmth was the family's public face. Vesper's precision was its foundation. She showed up at family events in impeccably cut suits and watches, and watched everything and said exactly what she meant and never one word more. I had met her at Declan's sister Petra's birthday dinner, 3 months after I met Declan himself. She had arrived 20 minutes late, which I would later understand was not lateness but a different understanding of time, the understanding of a woman who scheduled her arrivals after the social warm-up and arrived when conversations were already in progress and she could assess the room without being assessed in return. She had looked at me across the dinner table with those dark, steady eyes and said simply, "You're the editor. Declan mentioned you." I had said, "I hope he was accurate." She had said, "He said you were smart. He's right." And then she had turned to address someone to her left, and I had sat with those 4 words for the rest of the meal and felt something I placed very carefully in a drawer I did not open. Something I identified accurately and refused to examine. She was Declan's twin sister. She was the most composed, specific, unsettling person I had met in years, and the drawer stayed closed, and I went home with Declan and did not look at what I had just put away. Over 3 years of family gatherings, birthday dinners, holiday celebrations, a christening, 2 different summer weekends at the Crane estate, I had cataloged Vesper the way you catalog something you have decided is not available to you. I knew that she kept her dark hair pinned at every professional or family event and wore it down at exactly 2 occasions I could remember. Petra's christening and a Christmas Eve dinner where she had arrived straight from a flight, coat still buttoned, hair loose against the collar of it, and the contrast of that looseness against everything else about her had been the kind of thing I looked away from very deliberately. I knew her coffee order, black Americano, double shot, because she ordered it identically at every brunch, and the specificity of the habit caught in my attention in the way specific habits catch when you are paying attention to something you have told yourself you are not paying attention to. I knew the particular quality of her attention when she was interested in what someone was saying, a concentrated stillness that made the room contract slightly around whatever held it. She had aimed that attention at me twice in 3 years. The birthday dinner and one other time. A Thanksgiving where Declan had drunk more than was good for him, and said something dismissive about my work in front of his mother, the kind of comment that was framed as teasing and landed as diminishment, and I had gone quiet in the way I went quiet when I was actually, specifically angry rather than just momentarily annoyed. And Vesper, from across the table, had watched. She had watched with the precise attention of someone noting something into a category they already had open, and then she had said, in the level, unhurried way she said everything, "Declan, apologize." He had apologized. He had told me in the car home that his sister was impossible and her opinions were performative, and I shouldn't read anything into it. I had not known, in that moment, precisely what I was reading into. I had closed the drawer again, more firmly, and continued. The wedding was in June, on the kind of Saturday that occurs in coastal cities and seems designed to make everything look better than it is. Clear sky, harbor light, the specific quality of warmth that makes outdoor events feel inevitable and right. Rowan Crane, Declan's younger brother by 2 years, was marrying Soleil Beaumont at the Harcourt Hotel in a ceremony that the Crane family's combined resources had turned into something approaching architecture. 300 guests. A ceremony and reception in the same venue. Dinner on the harborside terrace. The string quartet. The flowers in every shade of cream and pale gold. The logistics had been managed by a professional events company and also, in the background and in the ways that mattered, by Vesper. She had reviewed the vendor contracts. She had resolved the dispute about the parking valets. She had reconfigured the seating chart twice, most recently the week before when Declan had argued about the placement of his university friends, and Vesper had told him, flatly, that the configuration he wanted would create noise interference near the quartet, and he had argued back and Vesper had let him win, and the friends had been seated exactly where Declan wanted, and exactly as close to the string quartet as Vesper had predicted. I knew all of this because Declan had told me about it at dinner, in the way he told me most things about Vesper, with the particular mixture of affection and frustration and something older, something that had the shape of a person who had been measured against the same standard their whole life and had developed a complicated relationship with that standard. The day of the wedding. I wore a sage silk dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, cut cleanly, nothing excessive. Declan had looked at me that morning and said I was beautiful and kissed me, and the kiss had felt, in that specific way that I would understand only in retrospect, like a person performing the expected thing rather than meaning it. But I was not in retrospect yet. I was in the elevator going down to the ceremony level, Declan's hand at my back, the warm mineral smell of the hotel corridors, the sound of the event building up around us. Vesper was across the aisle from us during the ceremony. She was in a black suit, not the formal black of mourning, but the deliberate black of someone who had decided a long time ago what her signature was and committed to it completely. The suit was perfectly cut in the way that expensive things are cut to look simple. Her hair was up. She had a single piece of jewelry, a small silver pin at the lapel that I could not identify from across the aisle, and spent more time trying to identify than was warranted by the distance or the occasion. She caught me looking. She did not react. She looked at the front of the room where Rowan was standing with his best man, and her face was doing its ordinary composed thing, and I looked away. The ceremony was beautiful in the specific way of ceremonies, where everyone who planned it had strong convictions and the resources to realize them. Pale flowers against dark wood. Afternoon light through tall windows cut into precise rectangles by the frames. Rowan's face when Soleil came down the aisle, the face of a person who could not believe their luck and was not attempting to conceal this fact. Declan cried. He was a person who cried at weddings. I had found this endearing and still did, in the abstract, but in this particular moment I noticed the tears with a slight double vision. The way you notice things when you are watching both the thing and yourself watching it. Vesper did not cry. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched her brother get married with the clear, quiet attention she brought to everything. I watched her watching Rowan for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. I stopped. The reception moved to the terrace as the afternoon light shifted into something gold and horizontal and kind to everyone it touched. Cocktail hour with the harbor views and the champagne and the small plates and the string quartet, beginning their first set. Declan moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who was genuinely comfortable in these environments, greeting people with the warmth that had made me fall for him in the first place, his hand periodically finding my arm or my back in the way of a man who is aware of his partner's presence in a room. An hour in, I had found myself in a conversation I was genuinely enjoying. Oliver Hale was a publishing industry person, a book scout for a European agency, connected to the Beaumont family through a cousin, and we had discovered, with the surprise of people finding overlap in unrelated circles, that we had both been tracking the same manuscript through different pipelines. It was a real conversation, the kind I rarely got at events like this, substantive and specific and genuinely interesting, and I had not been performing enjoyment. I had been actually having it. Declan appeared. He appeared in the way of someone who had been watching from a distance for longer than he made visible. He put his hand at my lower back. The touch was not light. "This is Oliver Hale," I said, managing the introduction without losing the thread of the conversation. "Oliver, my fiancé, Declan." Oliver was pleasant and easy. Declan was pleasant and easy. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, and then Oliver excused himself for the seating transition and moved away. Declan waited until there was enough distance. He said quietly and precisely, "How long have you been talking to him?" I said, "About an hour." "He knows a manuscript I've been following." His jaw had the set I had seen before in arguments about small things that turned out not to be small. In the specific moments when Declan's considerable social composure slipped its frame and something older and less managed showed through the gap, he said, "In front of my entire family." I said, "Declan, he works in publishing. We had a professional conversation." He said, "This is my brother's wedding." I said, "I am aware of where we are." He said, quieter, "You make me look like an idiot." The coldness that moved through me was not fear. It was recognition, the specific temperature of a moment when the version of a person you have been living with reveals itself as a performance, and the performance has just stopped. I said, "I was having a work conversation. That is not something I am going to apologize for." He said, "You were flirting." I said, "I was not." He used my name. 2 syllables, sharp, in the way that names become commands, when the person using them has stopped asking and started insisting. I said, "I'm not going to have this conversation here." I turned to go. Toward the terrace railing, toward the harbor, toward any space that was not this specific moment. I had 3 steps before he caught my arm, not gently. Not the way you catch an arm to slow someone down, but the way you catch something you are trying to prevent from leaving. I turned back. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen in 3 years of knowing him. Something that had been managed for a very long time and had stopped being managed. "Let go," I said. He let go. And then, in the same motion so fast it preceded any thought, so fast I could not have anticipated or stepped back from it, he raised his hand and brought it across my face. The sound was the worst part. Not the impact, which was real and would leave a mark and would be looked at by a hotel doctor 2 hours later. The The specific sharp contact of palm against cheek in an outdoor space, in a crowd, at a family wedding, with the string quartet still playing, and 200 people in the immediate vicinity. The string quartet stopped. The terrace stopped. All of it, every conversation, every gesture, every glass being lifted paused in the collective way of people who have witnessed something that has placed them involuntarily inside, a moment they did not consent to be inside. I stood there. My ring was on my finger. The harbor was behind me. Declan's face was already in the process of doing something complicated with the knowledge of what it had done, not regret, or not only regret, but the specific recomposition of someone who has broken something and is watching it break in real time and cannot stop watching. My legs made their own decision. They stopped cooperating. I sat down on the marble tile of the terrace in my sage silk dress, and I did not know in that exact moment what the next thing was supposed to be. Declan's voice, leery, Vesper's voice. Get up, I've got you. She was there in seconds. I did not, in the immediate processing of the moment, understand how she had gotten there. She had been across the terrace, near the bar, and the terrace was large and there were 200 people between us. She had moved through all of it. Later, I would understand that she had been watching. Later, I would understand that watching Declan at family events specifically, carefully, with the attentive precision of someone who had a category for his behavior and had been tracking whether it was developing, was something she had been doing for longer than she had admitted to anyone. She knelt on the marble floor of the terrace in her tailored black suit. She was not performing calm. She was calm, in the specific way of someone for whom calm is not the absence of something but the active presence of complete decision. She said, quiet enough for only me. Get up. I've got you. She put her hand under my arm and I got up. My legs cooperated. I stood in my sage dress on the marble terrace with the ring on my finger and the harbor behind me and 200 people watching. Vesper turned to face the room. She stood, in the way she stood, in every room she took responsibility for, with the specific gravity of a person who has decided that the situation is now hers and is not asking anyone's permission for that decision. She said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "The evening continues. Please give us a moment." She said it the way she said everything, operational, without inflection, without apology, with the absolute certainty that the thing she said would be done. And it was. People moved. Conversations began again, tentatively, and then with increasing conviction. The quartet, following the instinct of professional musicians who understand that events require bridging, resumed. The terrace reconstituted itself around us. I was aware of Declan still somewhere behind me. I was aware of Harriet Crane Declan and Vesper's mother appearing from somewhere near the table arrangement, her face running through the specific sequence of a woman processing multiple incompatible inputs simultaneously and not yet having decided which register to respond from. I was aware of Bex, who had been my guest, somewhere in the crowd, who I could not look for yet because looking required turning around. Vesper had her hand at my elbow. Light contact, not gripping. Just present the specific physical language of, I am here and I am not going anywhere. She walked me toward the interior of the hotel, not rush the pace of two people moving with purpose and something that could be mistaken for composure from a distance. Through the terrace doors, through the ballroom with its tall windows, through the corridor toward the elevator bank, the soft orchestral hum of a hotel in full event operation around us. She did not speak until the elevator doors closed. Then she said, "Are you hurt?" It was not a question the way she said it. It was the first item on a list she was working through. I said, "Not seriously." She said, "Your face." I said, "I know." She said. "A doctor, tonight." Not for documentation purposes, though that's also relevant, because I want to know the actual state of things. I said, "Vesper." She said, "I know. Yes, a doctor. The elevator was small and warm and smelled faintly of the cedar and light citrus that I had associated with her specifically since the Thanksgiving 3 years ago where she had stood beside me briefly near the kitchen and I had cataloged the scent with the precision of a person filing things they are not supposed to have. I was in the elevator with that specific smell now, and the ring was on my finger, and everything had a slightly fractured quality, like reality was still rendering. She had pressed 14, her floor. I said, "This is your room." She said, "I keep a suite when I'm managing family events. It's operationally simpler." I said, "You're taking me to your hotel suite." She said, "I'm taking you somewhere that is not the terrace. If you'd prefer the lobby, we can go to the lobby." The elevator opened. I walked through the door. The suite was ordered in the way of someone who works in all their spaces. A laptop on the desk, a stack of manila folders with the edges aligned, a jacket over the back of the desk chair that I recognized as the one she'd been wearing earlier in the day. She had been up here at some point in the evening already. The lamp by the sofa cast everything in a warm, contained light. Through the window, the harbor was doing what the harbor did at night, going still and dark and reflective at its edges. She went to the minibar. She poured 2 glasses of water. She set one on the coffee table. She said, "Sit down." I sat. The sofa was a deep blue gray. The room smelled of cedar, and the neutral clean of good hotels and the faint trace of her, which I noted and did not permit myself to dwell on. I looked at my hand. The ring was still on my finger. I looked at it for a long time. Vesper sat in the armchair across from the sofa, not close, present. The specific arrangement of a person who has decided they are staying for the full duration and is configuring themselves for it. She said, "You don't have to talk." I said, "I know," she said. "You also don't have to be all right immediately." I said, "I'm aware." The room was quiet in the specific way of hotel rooms, insulated, held above the city, existing in a kind of suspended time that ordinary buildings don't offer. I said, "How long has he been doing that?" She said, "Tonight was the first time." "In public?" I said, "In private?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the water glass she was holding with both hands. She said, "I didn't know the specifics. I had observed a pattern of pressure. The kind that doesn't always manifest in ways that are visible from the outside or documentable from the inside." I said, "You suspected something." She said, "He's my twin. I have known him for 32 years. I know the shape of what he does when he is angry in a way that he cannot entirely conceal from me, even when he conceals it from everyone else." I said, "And you didn't say anything." She held my gaze. She did not look away from the weight of the question. She said, "Because I didn't have anything specific. Because suspecting a pattern in someone's behavior is not the same as being certain of it, and certainty is what that kind of conversation requires. Because you seemed more than capable of your own assessments." A pause. She said, "Those were the wrong calculations to make. I'm sorry. I had not expected the apology." I sat with it for a moment and let it be real rather than performing that I was fine. I said, "The ring was chosen without asking what I wanted." She said, "I know. He showed it to me before he ordered it. I told him to ask you first." I said, "He didn't." She said, "No." I reached down and took the ring off my finger. I set it on the coffee table between us. It made a small, specific sound against the wood that was its own kind of period at the end of a sentence. The room reconstituted itself around that sound. Vesper looked at the ring on the table. She looked at me. She said nothing. "No. Wait. Think about it. Give it time." None of the managing phrases that people offer to slow a woman down from a decision she has already made. I said, "I need to call Bex." She said, "Of course. Use the room phone or your own, whatever you prefer." I said, "I'll need to get my things from Declan's room." She said, "I'll handle the transfer." She said it the way she said all operational things, not as an offer, but as a fact she was organizing while she spoke. She picked up the hotel phone. She spoke to someone at the front desk for approximately 90 seconds, in the calm, unhurried register she used for all professional communications, and put it down. She said, "Your things will be transferred to a room on the 12th floor by morning. You won't need to interact with him to retrieve them. The room is on the family account." I stared at her. She said, "You look surprised." I said, "You did all of that in 90 seconds. She said, "The hotel has been hosting Crane family events for 6 years. They know the relevant account details." I said, "Of course they do." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. The specific millimeter I had been cataloging across 3 years of family dinners and storing in the drawer with everything else. "There and gone," she said. "The room is yours for as long as you need it. If he disputes the charge, he'll have to explain the context, which he won't do." I said, "You're certain of that?" She said, "Yes." The certainty was not performance. It was the complete, settled knowledge of someone who had been reading the same person for 32 years and had learned where the edges of his courage were. I called Bex. She answered in one ring, which meant she had been sitting with her phone in her hand. She said, "Where are you?" I said, 14th floor, Vesper Crane's suite." A silence. Then, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "I'm coming up." I said, 12th floor is being set up. Meet me there," she said. "Found. Be there in 10. She hung up. I put the phone down. Vesper looked at me from across the room. She had been very still throughout the call, giving me the sonic privacy of the conversation without leaving. She said, "Your friend is efficient." I said, "She's been my best friend for 9 years. Efficiency is the baseline." She said, "Good." She stood. She picked up the jacket from the desk chair and began to put it on with the particular economy of someone who is returning to function from a state they had temporarily suspended. I said, "You're going back down." She said, "Someone has to manage the next 2 hours. Rowan and Soleil should not have their reception defined by what just happened on the terrace. My mother needs someone to be the operational presence." I said, "And that's you." She said, "It is generally me." She buttoned the jacket. She turned toward the door. I said, "Vesper." She stopped. I said, "Thank you for getting me off the floor." She turned back. In the lamplight of the suite, with the harbor through the window and the ring on the coffee table, she looked at me with the specific quality of attention she almost never used in my direction, the full version, the one she aimed at things she was genuinely accounting for. She said, "I should have gotten you off the floor before there was a floor to be on." I said, "That's not a thing you could have arranged." She said, "No, but I should have said something earlier, whatever the certainty threshold was." I said, "You couldn't have known he would." She said, "No, but the direction was visible. And I chose to manage my own uncertainty about it rather than say the difficult thing. That was the wrong choice." She held the look a moment longer. Then she moved her eyes to the door, recalibrating. She said, "The room key is on the nightstand. Minibar is stocked. Your friend will be there shortly." I said, "Vesper." She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She turned halfway. I said, 4 minutes. She looked at me. I said, "You're 4 minutes older. That's the margin between the one who manages everything and the one who breaks things." She was still for a moment that had a slightly different quality than her other stillnesses. She said, "The margin is irrelevant." I said, "I know. I thought it was worth saying anyway." She left. The door closed with the specific soft click of a heavy hotel door meeting its frame, and I sat in the blue-gray suite with the harbor outside and the ring on the coffee table and the sound of the string quartet filtering up from the terrace below, resuming its program, bridging the gap between the moment that had just happened and the evening that was supposed to continue. I thought about 4 minutes. About the architecture of a family built on that margin. About the woman who had crossed a terrace full of witnesses and knelt on a marble floor in a tailored black suit and said, "Get up, I've got you," with the specific quality of someone who had already made a decision they were not yet naming. Bex arrived 14 minutes later, which was fast enough that she must have run from wherever she was. She was in the bridesmaid dress she'd worn to a different wedding in May. She'd been a guest tonight in something green and structured, and she had removed her heels somewhere in the transit, and arrived in stockinged feet with the shoes in one hand and her face doing everything she had chosen not to say on the phone. She looked at me. She looked at the ring on the coffee table. She sat down beside me on the sofa. She put her arm around my shoulders and said nothing. After a while, she said, very carefully, "How long has Vesper Crane had a standing suite here?" I said. "She books it for Crane family events." Beck said. "And she brought you here?" I said. "She got me off the terrace." Beck said. "She got you off the floor and brought you to her personal hotel suite and then went back downstairs to manage the event." I said. "Yes." Bex was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ring. She looked at me. She looked at the ring again. She said, "You took it off." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She did not say anything else about Vesper that night. Bex was the kind of friend who knew the exact geography of when to say a thing and when to store it, a quality I had relied on for 9 years and had never been more grateful for than in this specific moment. The hotel transferred my things from Declan's room while I slept. In the morning, I found them in neat, organized groupings near the closet of the 12th floor room, packed better than I had packed them, which was either the hotel's exceptional service or evidence that Vesper had specified exactly how she wanted it handled. Both, probably. I slept in the hotel bathrobe, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has had the structure of their life abruptly removed and has not yet processed what the space means now that the structure is gone. I did not cry. I noted this as information and did not examine it. In the morning, I was at the hotel breakfast at 6:15, in the corner by the window with the harbor, before anyone in the wedding party was likely to be awake. Coffee and the view and the particular peace of being the only person in a public space at an hour when it still belongs to the quiet. Vesper came in at 6:20. Dark trousers and a cream blouse, her hair down only the second time I had seen it, and the contrast did to my attention what it always did. She had her phone in one hand and a thin folder in the other. She was in transit, stopping for coffee, passing through. She saw me. She made a decision in approximately 1 second. She walked to my table. She sat down in the chair beside it, not formally across, but beside, at the angle of someone who has chosen proximity over configuration. She said, "How did you sleep?" I said, "Adequately." She said, "That's an honest answer." I said, "You look like you've been awake for hours." She said, "I have been." She set the folder on the table. She ordered from the server, who appeared with the instinct of good hotel staff for people who matter. Black Americano, double shot, no variation, the same as it always was. I said, "I know your order." She looked at me. I said, 3 years of family brunches. You've never changed it." She said, "Consistency reduces decision fatigue." I said, "That is the most Vesper Crane sentence I have ever heard you say." The corner of her mouth moved. The precursor. The millimeter I had in the drawer. She said, "Declan is leaving the hotel this morning. He'll stay at his apartment. He won't contact you before you're ready. I've communicated that with sufficient clarity." I said, "He listens to you." She said, "When the communication is clear enough." I thought about what sufficient clarity sounded like coming from Vesper Crane. I thought about Declan hearing it. I thought about the specific quality of growing up as the person who is being managed by someone who is 4 minutes older and significantly more precise and has decided that something requires handling. I said, "What did you say to him?" She said, "That what he did was indefensible, that he would not compound it, that the ring is legally yours, and the question of what you do with it is entirely outside his input." She looked at the folder on the table. She said, "These are the hotel receipts. Your room is extended through Friday." "Longer if you need it," I said. "I don't need until Friday." She said, "The extension stands regardless." I said, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "Because it needs to be done." I said, "That's what you say when you don't want to say the real thing." She looked at me. across the coffee and the harbor and the morning light. She looked at me with the full version of the attention she kept at half power at family events, with the clear and specific quality of a woman who is deciding how much of the drawer to open. She said, because he should not have done what he did, and the fact that I saw the direction of it and did not say something has left me with a responsibility I intend to fulfill correctly. I said, that's still the official answer, she said. Yes, I said. I know. A pause in which the harbor did nothing and the coffee was warm and the morning held itself around us. I said, the ring. I want you to know, I had already decided about the ring before Saturday. It wasn't the event that decided it. She absorbed this. She said, how long? I said, 4 months. Possibly longer. The honest answer is that I had been building a case against myself for looking directly at something I'd already known for longer than 4 months, and the case was very well constructed. She said, you're good at cases. I said, apparently not in the relevant application. She was quiet for a moment. She turned her water glass in her hands, a small, slightly unusual motion for someone whose hands were generally still. She said, I know the shape of that. The case you build against examining something. The sentence was small and landed in the space between us with a weight that was not accidental. She heard it land. Her eyes shifted a fraction, registering. She said, I should go. Rowan and Soleil are leaving this morning and I need to be available. I said, of course. She stood. She picked up the folder. She left enough money on the table for both coffees without making a production of it. She stopped 3 steps away, she said without turning, if you need anything this week. For the legal elements, the ring, anything practical. You have my number. I said, I have it. She walked out. I sat with the harbor and the coffee, and the morning and the specific weight of a conversation that had said several things without saying them. In the particular language of a woman who managed everything except the things she was not yet ready to manage. I spent 3 days in the hotel. On Sunday afternoon, Harriet Crane texted, a single, careful message in the specific register of a woman who had been trained since birth in the performance of a certain kind of family grace and was now accountable for the way that performance had been covering something real. She wrote, I am deeply sorry for what happened Saturday. I do not expect a response. I want you to know it was indefensible, and that I said so to Declan directly. Whatever you need from this family in the coming days, Vesper will help you navigate it. I read it 3 times. I found the part that needed the most reading. Vesper will help you navigate it, and sat with what that sentence meant. About the structure of the Crane family. About who actually ran it and had always run it. About the fact that Harriet Crane, faced with a crisis of her own son's making, had instinctively named Vesper as the person to contact. Not because Vesper was warmest, because Vesper was reliable in the specific way that warm people often are not. I did not respond. I set the phone down and looked at the harbor from the 12th floor window and thought about what it meant to be the reliable one. What you gave up to be that. What it cost. Bex came back Monday. She brought coffee and pastries and her laptop and the specific, grounded efficiency of someone who had decided that what was needed was company plus productivity rather than emotion management. We sat in the hotel room, and she worked, and I went through my email for the first time since Saturday, and the normalcy of it, the manuscripts waiting for my notes, the editorial calendar, the gentle follow-up from an author whose galleys were due was both strange and exactly right, like putting on the particular clothing of your actual life and finding that it still fits. Bex said, at one point, without looking up from her screen. She texted you last night. I said, how do you know? She said, because you had that look this morning. I said, what look? She said, the one you get when you're deciding whether something is allowed. I looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone who has been a best friend for 9 years and has earned the right to be occasionally precise about it. She said, I'm not going to say the thing out loud. I just want you to know that I can see whatever is happening and that the timing is what the timing is and that I'm not going to weigh in on it until you want me to. I said, "That's a remarkable amount of restraint." She said, "I've been practicing." I said, "Thank you." She said, "You'll tell me when you're ready." I said, "I will." She went back to her laptop. I went back to my email. The harbor was still outside the window, and the morning was still happening, and whatever was in the drawer was still in the drawer, adjusting to the new light. I went home Wednesday. My apartment, the one I had kept through the engagement, the small one with good southern light and bookshelves that covered 2 walls and a kitchen that was the right size for one person who cooked thoughtfully rather than often. I stood in the middle of it and felt something that was not happiness, but was the specific relief of being in a space that was entirely mine. The ring was in my bag. The mark on my face had faded to a shadow. My things had been returned. Bex came over that evening with food and the sustained, grounded loyalty of 9 years. We ate and watched something neither of us attended to, and she left at 10 with the promise to call in the morning. My phone lit up at 10:30. Vesper. "How is the apartment?" I held the phone for a moment. I wrote, "Fine. Good light. My own." She wrote, "Good." A pause longer than her usual ones. She wrote, "The week was difficult. I hope the next one is considerably less so." I wrote, "You managed a significant portion of other people's difficult this week." She wrote, "That's the role." I wrote, "Is it always the role?" Another pause, longer still. She wrote, "Sometimes it's the thing I know how to do when the other things are harder." I sat with that, with the specific precision of what she had not said. "The other things." I wrote, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years of family events." The pause that followed was long enough that I set the phone down and then picked it up again. She wrote, "I should let you rest." I wrote, "You should." I put the phone on the table and looked at the ceiling of my apartment, with the good light now translated into the darkness of a late Wednesday, and thought about the shape of what was happening. The very careful, very deliberate, very Vesper shape of a woman who was handling practical things, because handling practical things was the closest she could move toward the thing she had decided she was not going to act on. I thought about the drawer, about the fact that the drawer had been open since she knelt on the marble floor and said, "Get up, I've got you," and I had not found a way to close it again. I was not sure I was going to try. I didn't try. I lay on my back in the dark of my apartment with the drawer open and let it be open, and in the morning I got up and made coffee and went to my desk and opened the manuscript I had been avoiding for 4 days and began to read. The prose was careful, and slightly too careful, the kind that needed loosening, and I spent 3 hours loosening it with the focused attention that editing requires, and that I had always found steadying in the way that physical work steadies people who work with their hands. By noon I had done something useful. By 2 I had done something good. By 5 I had returned to a version of myself I recognized. Vesper texted on Thursday. Not late at night, 10 in the morning, which was a different register entirely, practical and daytime and brisk. She wrote, "The ring." For the legal record, it was a gift made in the context of an engagement that is now dissolved. Depending on jurisdiction, the classification differs. "I can walk you through your options. When you're ready." I wrote back, "Ready now." She wrote, "Call me at 6 if that suits." She called at 6:02. The 2 minutes were probably the time it took to close her office door. She walked me through the legal framework with the clean efficiency she brought to all technical explanations, no performance of reassurance, no softening of the information to make it easier to receive. Just the relevant facts in the relevant order, with space left for my questions, which she answered completely and without impatience. The ring was mine to do with as I chose. The options were, keep it, return it through the family, sell it independently, or donate it to an organization of my choosing. She had opinions about which option was cleanest, and she shared them when I asked. I said, "Which would you choose?" She said, "I would donate it. A domestic violence shelter, given the specific context. But that's my calculation. The ring is yours." I said, "That's a very specific calculation." She said, "It seemed the most appropriate use of the asset." I said, "Yes. Let's do that." A small silence. She said, "I'll draft the transfer document. You'll need to sign a brief letter. I can have it ready by tomorrow." I said, "Vesper." She said, "Yes." I said, "You calculated all of that before you called me." A pause that was very slightly longer than her other pauses. She said, "I had considered the options." "Yes." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Of course." She stayed on the line for one additional second before hanging up. I noted the second. The following week was the particular texture of reassembled ordinary life, the kind that doesn't feel ordinary while you're inside it, but which is doing the work of rebuilding something essential. I went to the office. I read manuscripts on the subway. I had lunch with my colleague Ren, who had heard what happened through the specific grapevine of overlapping social circles and said, with the direct warmth of someone who doesn't manage feelings for the comfort of the room, "That man was always performing." I never said it because it wasn't my place and you were choosing him, but I'm saying it now. You're well out. I appreciated the honesty. It was the kind that didn't ask me to perform gratitude or resilience in return. Bex took me to the farmer's market on Saturday. We walked through the stalls in the early light with coffee and paper cups, and she bought herbs she would probably not use, and I bought a plant for the kitchen windowsill because I had wanted a plant for the kitchen windowsill for 2 years. And had not bought one because Declan said he forgot to water things, and I had absorbed the constraint without examining why I had. I bought the plant. I put it on the windowsill. It was a good decision, and also a small one, and both of those things were true simultaneously, Beck said, watching me settle the pot into the light. "You look more like yourself." I said, "I think I am." She said, "The texts are still happening." I looked at her. She said, "I'm not going to say the thing. I just want to know if you know that they're happening." I said, "I know they're happening." She said, "Good." She bought the herbs. We walked. Declan made contact on the Tuesday of the second week. Not by phone, I had not answered the 2 calls he'd made the week before, but through a message delivered via Rowan, who sent me a text that was clearly written by someone trying to be a neutral carrier for information that was not neutral. He said, "Declan wants you to know he's in therapy. He said to tell you that if there was anything you needed to say to him, he would listen. He also said he understands if you don't want to." I sat with this for a while. I did not feel the need to say anything to Declan. I had already said the thing that needed saying by taking the ring off and putting it on the coffee table of a hotel suite that was not his. I texted Rowan back. "I appreciate you relaying this. I wish Declan well. I don't have anything to add," Rowan wrote. "I'm sorry, Leary, for all of it." I wrote, "Thank you for the wedding invitation. It was a beautiful ceremony. I mean that." He sent a small, grateful reply. I put my phone down and went back to the manuscript I was working on, which was a quiet literary novel about 2 people who kept almost meeting and kept not quite meeting, and eventually met in a train station in the 3rd act, and which I was finding, for reasons I was not going to examine at noon on a Tuesday in my office, extremely compelling. Vesper texted that evening. The transfer document for the ring donation, it was attached as a PDF, perfectly formatted, with a tab marking the signature line. There was a single line of accompanying text. "The shelter director has been notified and is expecting the piece. No further action required from you after signing." I signed it. I scanned it. I sent it back. I wrote, "You drafted this on a Tuesday evening." She wrote, "It's a straightforward document." I wrote, "How's the rest of your Tuesday?" A pause. Then, long, productive, better now. I held the phone and thought about better now. About the specific shape of that, the 2 words that weren't what she would have said in a professional email or a family context, the 2 words that had slipped through the register she maintained and come out honest. I wrote, "My kitchen has a plant now." She wrote, "That's a significant development." I wrote, "I've wanted one for 2 years." She wrote, "What changed?" I wrote, "I stopped waiting to be told whether I was allowed." The pause that followed was long enough that I wondered if I had said too much. Then she wrote, "Good." 1 word. But the specific good that meant more than it said, the same one she'd used in the hotel breakfast, the same register of simple, complete approval that she had always used for things she considered correct decisions. I had been storing those goods in the drawer too. I was aware of this now in a way I had not let myself be before. The third week, an incident at work, a junior editor who had made a significant error in a manuscript timeline and who I was trying to help correct without it becoming a catastrophic problem. I stayed late 3 days in a row, managing the moving parts with the focused pragmatism that crises in publishing require, which mostly meant phone calls and emails and the careful repositioning of several people's expectations at once. On the third late night, at 9:30, I was at my desk with the lamp on and the office empty around me, and my cold coffee and the specific satisfaction of a problem that had been mostly solved, and my phone lit up. Vesper, still at the office. Not a question. I wrote, "How did you know?" She wrote, "Your read receipts. You've been responding from the same location for 3 days." I wrote, "You've been tracking my read receipts." A pause. Then, "I've been paying attention to whether you were all right." I sat with that. In the empty office with the lamp and the cold coffee and the harbor visible from the window 3 blocks away if you knew which direction to look. I wrote, "I'm all right. A work crisis. Nearly resolved." She wrote, "Good. Go home." I wrote, "Soon." She wrote, "Leary." She had used my name. Not Lyrian, not the formal version, the 2-syllable shorthand that only people who knew me used, and that she had used twice before, both times in the hotel, and both times with the specific quality of something she had decided she was allowed to say. I wrote, "Give me 40 minutes." She wrote, "I'll be outside your building in 45. I stared at the phone. I wrote, "What?" She wrote, "I had a dinner nearby that ended early. It's a 10-minute walk. 45 minutes is sufficient for you to finish and get your coat." I said nothing for a moment. I looked at the lamp and the manuscript and the cold coffee and the harbor somewhere in the dark outside the window. I wrote, "All right." She was there in 43 minutes. I came out of the building into the warm June evening, and she was standing on the pavement outside in a dark blazer and trousers, hair down again, phone in her hand in the posture of someone who has been using it to look occupied while waiting. She looked up when I came through the glass door. She said, "You look like you've been working for 12 hours. I said, 11. "How was the dinner?" She said, "Functional. Walk with me." We walked. No particular destination, just the city and the direction of the harbor, in the warm June dark, at the pace of 2 people who had decided to be somewhere together, without requiring a reason for it. The street was quiet in the way city streets go quiet after 9, traffic thinning, the restaurants still lit but their noise more contained. She said, "The crisis at work." I said, "A timeline error that compounded. Nearly sorted now." She said, "You handled it." I said, "That's generally my response to things." She said, "I've noticed." The harbor appeared at the end of the street, not dramatically, just the way things appear when you've been walking toward them. The railing, the water, the city lights on the other side doing their reflective work. We stopped at the railing. The water was dark and moving, and the air smelled of its salt and the particular clean of moving water at night. She said, "How are you?" Not the operational answer. I said, "Better than I was, clearer. I'm finding that doing the things I had stopped doing because they didn't fit around him is useful. The plant. Working late when the work needs it. Choosing my coffee order instead of accommodating someone else's preference for the space." She said, "The accommodations accumulate." I said, "Yes, they do, and you stop noticing which ones are reasonable and which ones are yours." She was quiet for a moment. The water moved. She said, "I should have seen more of what was accumulating. For you specifically." I said, "You weren't in my apartment." She said, "No. But I was at the family events. I watched how he spoke to you at those. The patterns were." She stopped. I said, "What were they?" She said, "Consistent with what I already knew about the direction of his behavior. And I kept the assessment internal." I said, Because you weren't certain enough, she said. Because I told myself I wasn't certain enough. And because you were the person I had the least right to say something to, I turned to look at her. She was looking at the water, the same profile I had catalogued across 3 years of family events, the jawline and the dark hair against the night. I said, "Why did you have the least right?" She held her eyes on the water for a moment. She said, "Because saying something to you would have required me to account for why I was paying that particular quality of attention to you specifically, and I had decided I wasn't going to account for that." The harbor was very still. I said, "When did you decide that?" She said, "The Thanksgiving." When he made the dismissive comment and I told him to apologize, I said, "That was almost 2 years ago." She said, "Yes." I said, "You've known for 2 years." She said, "What I've known and what I've permitted myself to act on are different things." I turned back to the water, the city lights on the far side, the specific quality of being beside someone at a railing at night in a city and having the conversation finally become honest. I said, "Vesper." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm going to ask you something." She said, "All right." I said, "Was the attention you paid to Declan's behavior, the tracking of the direction of it, was part of that about wanting a reason?" A long silence. The water. "A distant boat," she said. "That's a precise question." I said, "I know." She said, "And I'm going to answer it precisely. No, I was not looking for a reason to end your engagement. I tracked his behavior because I know my twin, and because the pattern concerned me genuinely and independently. If there had been nothing concerning, I would still have been managing the same thing I've been managing." I said, "The thing you had decided you weren't going to account for." She said, "Yes." I said, "And now?" She looked at me, straight and complete, and without the composure serving as a barrier for the first time since I had known her. She said, "Now I am accounting for it, with the understanding that you are 3 weeks out of something that broke badly and that my accounting for it is not the same as acting on it." I said, "Not like this." She said, "Not like this. Not while you're still rebuilding. Not when the honest version might be mistaken for the version where you're reaching for something because everything else just fell apart." I said, "I know the difference." She said, "I believe you. I also know that 3 weeks is not enough time for either of us to be certain of that." I looked at her. The woman who knelt on a marble floor and said, "Get up, I've got you." Who handled every practical element of the aftermath because handling things was the closest she could move toward the things she had been not saying for 2 years. Who was standing at a harbor railing at 10 in the evening telling me not like this with the specific and unconditional integrity of someone who was refusing to take the thing she wanted most because the version on offer was not yet the right version. I said, "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." She said, "I'm trying to do better with that." I said, "I know." We stood at the railing for another few minutes without speaking, which was a different kind of conversation. Then she walked me to my street and stopped at the corner and said she would call a car from here. I said, "Vesper." She turned. I said, "What you said. I heard it. All of it." She held my gaze. She said, "I know you did. Go home. Water your plant." Something moved in my chest that I did not try to qualify. I went home. I watered the plant. I sat at my kitchen table with the last of the day's coffee and thought about the phrase, "not like this," and what it meant that the sentence existed, and what it would mean when the time it was waiting for finally arrived. 2 months. I am compressing the time because what it contained was the particular texture of ordinary life becoming fully itself again, which is important and not dramatic, and the dramatic is coming and requires space. 2 months of Thursdays, at the farmer's market with Bex, who said nothing but noticed everything. Of manuscripts that needed loosening and galleys that needed attention and meetings that went well because they were about books and books were the thing I understood most completely. Of the plant on the kitchen windowsill doing what plants do when they are given sufficient light and regular water, growing slowly and without announcement in the direction of what they need. of Vesper, who texted with the regularity of someone who had given up managing the frequency of it. Sometimes practical, a question about a document, a note about the donation receipt arriving from the shelter. Sometimes not, an article about a book she thought I might find interesting, sent with no commentary, just the link. One evening, a photograph of the harbor from what appeared to be an office window several floors above my usual vantage point, sent without explanation, and I had looked at it for a long time and written back, "Good view." She had written back, "I thought of you." 3 words. I had put them in the drawer, but the drawer was already so full of things I had put there that it no longer closed properly, and I had stopped trying to close it. In August, Harriet Crane called. She called, not texted, which was itself information about the weight she was assigning to the conversation. She said, "I'd like to see you, if you're willing. Not for Declan's sake and not to manage anything. I would like to see how you are." I thought about Harriet Crane. The specific, complicated thing, she was the woman who had built a family around a performance of a certain kind of grace, and was now accountable for the gaps in that performance. She had loved me, in the way she loved the people in Declan's life who reflected well on him, which was a real love, and also a contingent one. But she had also, at 2 different family dinners, said things to me that were not contingent things about my work, my perspective, the specific things I brought to conversations that she found interesting. Those things had been real too, I said. All right. We had lunch at a restaurant she chose, in a part of the city that was hers, old money and good tables, and the specific warmth of a place that had been feeding the same families for decades. She arrived before me and stood when I came in, and the look on her face was not managed. It was the face of a woman who had been carrying something for 2 months and was glad to set some of it down in person. She said, "You look well." I said, "I am." She said, "I want to say something clearly and without asking you to do anything with it. What Declan did was indefensible, and I am ashamed that I watched the shape of it building for years and called it temper and managed around it instead of addressing it. That was my failure as much as his." I said, "You couldn't have." She said, "I want you to let me say this without the generosity. I can see it in you, the reflex to absolve. Please don't." I stopped. She said, "I watched my son treat you as something he had acquired rather than someone he had chosen, for most of the time you were together. I made excuses for it in the way mothers make excuses for their children past the age when excuses are appropriate, and the result of that is what happened on Rowan's terrace. I am sorry." I held it. I didn't absolve it. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "He's in therapy. He's addressing things. I'm not saying this to ask you to reconsider anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to know it." I said, "I wish him well. I mean that." She said, "I know you do. It's very much like you." We had lunch. We talked about Rowan and Soleil's honeymoon, which had gone well. We talked about a book I was editing that Harriet had read in manuscript because she had connections in the literary world that I had always found slightly surprising. We talked about the harbor view, which was visible from the restaurant's east windows, and she said something about how the harbor looked different depending on the season, and I thought about Vesper's photograph sent from the office window and said nothing. When we were finishing, Harriet looked at me across the table with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to say something. She said, "Vesper checks on you." I said, "I know." She said, "She checks on you the way she manages the things she considers important." I held the water glass and looked at Harriet Crane. She said, "I'm not asking you about it. I'm not managing anything. She doesn't manage things casually. She never has. If she's tracking whether you're all right, it's because she's decided it's her responsibility. And Vesper doesn't decide something is her responsibility unless she believes she belongs to it." She held my gaze. She said, "That's all I'm going to say about that." I said, "That's quite a lot for someone who isn't saying anything." She almost smiled. For one moment she looked remarkably like Vesper, the corner of the mouth, the precision of the expression. She said, "I've been practicing understatement. It's more effective than I expected." I went home from lunch with Harriet Crane's words, sitting in the space where I processed things that required processing. She doesn't decide something is her responsibility unless she believes she belongs to it. I sat at my kitchen table, with the plant in the window and the September light coming in sideways, and thought about belonging, about the specific word Harriet had chosen. Not invested, not concerned, belongs to it. I texted Vesper. I had lunch with your mother today. The response came in 3 minutes. I know. She told me she was going to reach out. Are you all right? I wrote. Yes. She was honest. She wrote. She can be. When she decides something requires it. I wrote. She said something about you. A longer pause than usual. She wrote. What did she say? I wrote. That you don't decide something is your responsibility unless you believe you belong to it. The pause that followed was the longest one she had ever made in any of our communications. Long enough that I set the phone down and picked it up again twice. She wrote, My mother has opinions about me. I wrote, She was right though, wasn't she? The pause again, shorter this time, as if she'd made a decision. She wrote, Yes, one word. The specific yes that was its own kind of account of everything she had decided to stop managing. I wrote, Coffee, this week. Not a legal consultation, not a practical matter. She wrote, Thursday. I wrote, Thursday. She wrote, The place near your office. 8 o'clock. I wrote, You know where my office is. She wrote, I know where your office is. I put the phone down and looked at the plant and the September light and thought about the shape of a decision that had been building for 2 years in a woman who decided things with precision and acted on them with patience. Thursday. She was there when I arrived, which was also how it had been at the hotel breakfast in June. The same configuration. Her in the chair by the window. Coffee already ordered. My cup on the table. She had not taken off her coat yet. Dark, impeccably cut, the collar turned up slightly against the September morning. Her hair was up, the watch on her left wrist. The small silver pin at the lapel that I had not had the opportunity to identify until now, close enough to see. A small geometric shape, precisely made, that looked like an architectural detail. I sat down. I said, The pin. I've been trying to identify it for 3 months. She looked at me. I said, Since the wedding. I could see it from across the aisle but not clearly enough. She looked at the pin. She said, It was my father's. A design detail from the first building Vale Industries developed. He had it made into a piece of jewelry and gave it to me when I made partner. I said, He gave it to you. Not Declan. She said, Declan doesn't wear jewelry. I said, He gave it to you specifically. She said, Yes. I said, Why? She said, Because I was the one who understood what the building cost him. He said I would understand the reference. I held my coffee cup and looked at the pin and thought about the specific quality of being the person who understands the reference, about what it meant to be that person in a family that required someone to be it. I said, Do you ever get tired of being the one who understands? She held my gaze across the table. She said, Sometimes, more recently than before. I said, What changed? She said, The things I was managing instead of saying. They became heavier than the managing was worth. The coffee shop was warm around us. Morning light through the windows. The particular ambient sound of a place that runs on conversation and caffeine. I said, Then say one. She looked at me. I said, One of the things. Say it. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee. She looked at me. She said, I noticed you before any of the rest of this. Before Declan mentioned you. Before the birthday dinner. I noticed you at a publishing event I attended peripherally because one of our development projects had a communications component. You were in the back of the room asking a question of a panel, and the question was specific and intelligent and cut through something the panel had been dancing around for 20 minutes. I didn't speak to you. I didn't know who you were. 3 weeks later, Declan told me he'd met someone and described you, and I knew it was you before he finished the sentence. I was very still. She said, That's one of them. I said, When was the event? She said, 4 years ago, 4 months before Declan introduced you. I said, you've known who I was for 4 years. She said, I've known what you were like for 4 years. Who you are has been something I've been adding to that for 3. I held the coffee cup. The morning light, the pin at her lapel. I said, and you said nothing. She said, you were with my brother. I said, I know, that's not a criticism, I'm just accounting for it. She said, I know you are. It's one of the things I noticed, the way you account for things without using the accounting to assign blame. I said, I'm a book editor. Precision about the difference between description and judgment is occupational. The corner of her mouth. The millimeter. Fully visible now. Not hidden. She said, that's the second thing. The way you make specific distinctions in casual conversation and don't announce that you've made them. I said, how many things are there? She said, a significant number. I said, tell me one more. She said, the plant. I said, the plant. She said, you texted me about the plant, that you'd bought it, and the reason you'd been waiting. And I understood, from the context of that message, that you had been making small reductions to yourself that you hadn't named as reductions, and the plant was the first thing you'd reclaimed. And I found the plant genuinely, specifically more significant than most events I track. I said, you found my houseplant significant. She said, yes. I said, that is either the most practical or the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. She said, I can't imagine the competition is steep. I said, you'd be surprised. She looked at me. Something in the composure shifted, not cracking, just moving, the way good structures move when tested by something real and are found to be exactly sound enough to accommodate it. She said, Leary, 2 syllables. The name in her mouth the way it had always been in her mouth. Precise, deliberate, like something she handled carefully. She said, I want to be clear about something. What I've just told you is not a move. It's not a strategy for something I'm trying to get to. It's an account of the things I should have said months ago, or years ago, and didn't. And I'm giving you the account because you asked for it, and because you deserve it, and because the version of me that kept managing it instead of saying it was wrong. I said, and after the account. She said, after the account, you decide what you want to do with it. I'm not here with an expectation. I'm here with an honest record. I said, Vesper. She said, yes. I said, the account is not a small thing to give someone. She said, I know. I said, it costs something. She said, yes. I said, thank you for paying it. She held my gaze for a long moment. In the morning light, in the coffee shop near my office, in September with the season turning and the plant at home in the window and the drawer fully open, she looked like the version of Vesper Crane that had always existed underneath the management. The woman who understood the reference, who noticed the question from the back of the room, who knelt on a marble floor in a tailored black suit and said, get up, I've got you. Not because it was her role, but because it was the only thing she was willing to do in that moment. She said, I'll let you get to the office. I said, have dinner with me. She blinked. I said, tonight. Not the harbor. Not a family occasion. Somewhere that is not a hospital or a hotel or a legal consultation. Dinner. She was quiet for a moment. She said, there's a place on Vine Street, a small Italian restaurant. I've eaten there alone twice this year. I said, why alone? She said, because I didn't have the right person to go with. I held that. I said, 7 o'clock. She said, 7 o'clock. She left first. I sat at the table for another 10 minutes with my coffee and the September light and the weight of everything that had just been said and the specific rightness of it, not ease, but rightness, the feeling that comes when a thing has taken the shape it was always supposed to take. The Italian restaurant was small and lit by candles in the specific way of places that have been feeding people earnestly for decades and haven't changed anything because nothing needs changing. Vesper was there when I arrived again before me, again the chair by the window. But this time she had taken her coat off. She was in a deep blue blouse and the watch and the pin, and her hair was up, and the candlelight was doing something to her face that the morning light did differently. She stood when I came to the table. It was an automatic gesture, the kind of thing so deeply ingrained it's not a performance but a reflex. I said, "Don't stand up for me." She said, "I didn't do it on purpose." I said, "I know. That's why I'm not objecting." I sat down. The server came. We ordered. The room was warm and contained and smelled of garlic and olive oil and the specific warmth of a room that has been heated by cooking and full tables for years. We talked. We talked about books and about the development project and about her father and the building the pin commemorated, which had been a commercial space on the waterfront that was now a public market. We talked about my family, my mother, who had called 3 times in June and once a week since, and who I had been, I admitted, not entirely honest with about the full extent of what had happened at the wedding. We talked about the specific feeling of rebuilding, which was not the same as recovering, and how you knew the difference. She said at one point with the particular precision she used when she was saying something she had thought about for a while, "You seem different than you did in June. Not recovered. Built." I said, "Built is the right word." "Yes." She said, "I've been watching it happen." I said, "I know you have." She said, "I wanted you to know I've noticed." I said, "I know that too." The candles threw our shadows up the walls and the restaurant talked around us in the way restaurants do when they are doing their job correctly, which is to make the table feel like its own country. We finished the main course and ordered dessert, and she ate something with a fig compote, and I watched her eat it with the entirely unreasonable attention of someone who has been storing observations for 4 years and has finally been given permission to observe openly. She noticed. She set her fork down. She said, "You're doing the thing where you catalog." I said, "I've been doing it for 4 years. I'm just doing it openly now." She said, "I don't mind." I said, "I know you don't." A silence that was warm, rather than charged, the kind that happens when 2 people have said the important things and can afford to be in the same space without needing the space to produce anything. She said, "This was a good choice." I said, "The fig compote or the restaurant?" She said, "Both, and the invitation." I said, "You'd eaten here alone twice. Someone needed to fix that." She said, "Is that why you asked?" I said, "Partly." She looked at me. I said, "Also because I've wanted to have dinner with you in a room like this since the first birthday dinner 3 years ago, and I am done pretending I haven't." The candlelight was doing something to the composure that made it soft rather than controlled, not the absence of structure but the presence of something that didn't require it. She said, "That was a long time to wait." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "You were very patient." I said, "I was very good at telling myself a story." She said, "Yes, I know that too. I wrote several drafts of the same story." I said, "What was yours called?" She said, "It had several titles. The most accurate was, 'She is with my brother and I am the reliable one, and that is the shape of things.'" I said, "That's a very long title." She said, "It was a very long story." The server brought the bill. Vesper had it before I could reach across. She did it without making it a point, just the clean efficiency of someone who had made a decision before the situation arose. I said, "You were going to do that regardless of anything I said." She said, "Yes." I said, "That's very like you." She said, "I know." We walked out of the restaurant into the September evening, which was cooler than it had been, the kind of autumn coolness that arrives at night before the days have committed to it. The street was quiet. The restaurant light spilled out behind us, and the city moved around us with its ordinary machinery. I stopped on the pavement. She stopped beside me. I looked at her, the navy blouse and the watch and the pin, her hair still up, the September air against both of us. I said, "Vesper." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm not running from anything. I'm not reaching for something to hold on to because everything else fell apart. This is not the wreckage." She held my gaze. I said, "I want you to know that specifically and clearly. Because you said not like this 3 months ago, and you were right, and I respected it, and now I need you to know that the 3 months happened, and I'm here. She said, I know, I said. Then say the rest of it. She looked at me. The specific look, the full version, the one she almost never used in my direction, the one that had the complete and undivided quality of all that composure, in service of one thing rather than the management of everything. She said, I've been aware of you in ways that had nothing to do with my brother's relationship for 4 years. I made the wrong choices about what to do with that awareness, repeatedly, and some of those wrong choices had consequences for you that I carry fully. I'm sorry. Not the performed kind. The kind where I know exactly what it cost and I don't ask you to make it smaller, she said. And I would like, if you're willing, to stop managing what I am toward you and start being honest about it instead, in whatever shape that takes, at whatever pace makes sense, without my putting a frame around it. I said, that's the whole thing. She said, yes. I said, no. Holding anything back. She said, no. I reached up and touched her jaw first, warm skin, the sharp, small breath she took, then I kissed her. It was not frantic. It was the opposite of frantic patient, specific, the careful, deliberate weight of something that had been building for 4 years and had earned every one of them. Her hand found my arm and settled there, not gripping, just present. I could feel the composure finally doing the thing it had been waiting to do, which was to stop managing and to simply hold. We stood on the pavement outside the restaurant in the September evening for a moment that had the specific quality of things that have arrived exactly when they were supposed to, not too soon. Then she said, against the small space still remaining between us, the plant. I said, what about it? She said, I'd like to see it, in the window. I said, now? She said, if that's all right. I said, it's been waiting to be seen for 3 months. She almost laughed. The real version, not the millimeter, not the precursor, but the actual unguarded thing, brief and warm, and entirely itself. She took my hand as we walked. Not dramatically, just the clean, certain gesture of someone who had made a decision and was no longer managing whether to make it. I did not pretend I had not noticed. I held her hand and we walked toward my apartment, and the city moved around us in the ordinary way of cities, when something significant is happening inside them that they have no way of knowing about. We stopped at the corner of my street. The lamplight was the warm amber of a good city neighborhood at 10 o'clock. My building was half a block ahead. She looked at the building. She looked at me. She said, I'm going to be honest with you. Going forward, about the things I would previously have managed internally and not said. I said, I know. She said, it's going to be a significant adjustment for both of us. I said, I'm a book editor. I work with difficult texts every day. She said, are you comparing yourself to a difficult text? I said, I'm comparing you to a manuscript that needed loosening. She looked at me for one moment with the expression I had been cataloging for 3 years and was now allowed to look at directly, the corner of the mouth, the full version of it, the millimeter resolving into something that was, simply, the face of a woman who was delighted and was not managing the fact that she was delighted. She said, that is either the most practical or the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I said, now we're even. We went inside. The plant was on the windowsill where I had put it in the good southern light, doing what it had been doing all summer, growing slowly and without announcement toward what it needed. Vesper stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at it with the same complete attention she brought to everything she considered worth attending to. She said, it's doing well. I said, it's had good conditions. She said, consistent water and the right light. I said, yes, exactly that. She looked at me, the lamp in the kitchen, the plant in the window, the September night outside, the navy blouse and the pin from her father and the composure doing the new thing, the thing it turned out it had always been capable of, which was holding something honest rather than something managed. She said, good conditions, I can work with that. We had tea in my kitchen, which was not a thing either of us had planned, and which was exactly the right ending for the evening, ordinary and specific, and entirely ours. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat on the back of the chair, and her hair coming slightly loose from where it had been pinned, and the pin at her lapel catching the lamplight once. She told me about the first building, the one her father built, and the one the pin commemorated. She told me what it had cost him and what he had understood about the cost, and why he had given the pin to her and not to Declan, which had to do with something he had said to her once when she was 23. "You will be the one who understands what things are built from. Keep the record." I said, "He was right." She said, "He usually was. About the things that mattered." I said, "That's a good way to think about it." She said, "He was not always right about the things that didn't matter. He had opinions about restaurants that were frankly unsustainable." I said, "That makes him more real to me." She looked at me, the warm, unguarded version of the look. She said, "Yes, I suppose it does." She left at midnight. At the door she stopped and turned and looked at me one more time with the full version of the attention, the one she'd been keeping at half power for 4 years. She said, "Thursday." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll bring the coffee this time." I said, "Black Americano, double shot." She said, "You've been paying attention." I said, 4 years of family brunches. I know your order." The corner of her mouth, the full version. The millimeter resolved into the thing it had always been the precursor to, which was simply Vesper Crane being glad. Not performing, not composing, just glad. She left. I stood in the doorway of my apartment and listened to the elevator close and let the specific quality of the evening settle around me like something that had arrived after a very long journey and had no intention of leaving. In October, 3 weeks later, Rowan and Soleil hosted a dinner, their first since the honeymoon, in their new apartment, a small gathering of the people they wanted around them in the shape of their new life. Vesper was invited. I was invited. Not as contingent halves of anything separately, by people who had thought about who they wanted at their table and had chosen us both. I arrived before Vesper. Rowan opened the door, and the look on his face when he saw me was the simple, uncomplicated warmth of a man who was glad to see someone he liked and was not managing anything about it. He said, "I'm really glad you came." I said, "I'm glad too." He said, "Vesper mentioned she'd been..." He stopped, considered. He said, "She mentioned that things were good." I said, "They are." He nodded. The warmth. Vesper arrived 20 minutes later. I heard the door from across the room. She came in with the specific economy of her movement and a bottle of wine she had selected with the precision she applied to all selections. And Rowan's expression when he saw her was different from his expression for me, the expression of a younger brother for the sibling who has always been. The reliable constant, warm and slightly odd in the way that familiarity doesn't eliminate. She came across the room to where I was standing near the kitchen window. She did not announce it. She simply moved through the room in the direction of where I was and stopped beside me. She said, quietly enough to be private, "Good evening." I said, "You brought the good wine." She said, "I had opinions about the pairing." I said, "Of course you did." She looked at me, the full version, openly, in a room with witnesses. I did not look away. Neither did she. Soleil noticed from across the room. She said something to the person beside her, quietly. The person looked. The room, which had been doing the warm and ambient thing that small dinners do, continued doing it, because the world contains all kinds of things, and people who are paying attention know most of them already. Rowan looked at his twin, and at me, and at his twin again, and his face did the specific thing it had probably been doing since childhood, when Vesper made a decision he understood without being told. He said, from across the room, "Dinners in 20. And the evening continued. It was, by every measurable standard, an ordinary dinner. Good food and wine, and conversation about things that mattered to the people in the room. Vesper sat beside me. Her hand found mine once under the table briefly, just long enough to be felt, and then she picked up her fork again, and the hand was gone, and the table continued. I thought about the marble floor of the Harcourt Hotel terrace, about the sound of the string quartet stopping, about "Get up, I've got you," said very quietly by a woman in a tailored black suit who had decided, before anyone else in the room had processed what had happened, where she was going to be. I thought about the drawer, about 4 years of it, about what it costs to keep something honest inside a space designed to contain it, and what it feels like when you finally don't have to anymore. After dinner, walking out into the October night, Vesper took my hand on the steps without making a point of it. The street was cool and lit in the way of a city neighborhood at night, warm windows and the sounds of other evenings overlapping with ours. She said, "This was good." I said, "Yes." She said, "Rowan was pleased." I said, "I noticed." She said, "He was very restrained about it." I said, "He's been practicing." She said, "Apparently it runs in the family." I said, "You're very funny." She said, "I've been told that before, occasionally." I said, "By whom?" She said, "By people who were paying attention." I held her hand and we walked in the October night in a city that was doing its ordinary thing around us, enormous and indifferent, and full of people having their own complicated evenings, and none of it required managing. She was, still, the most composed woman in every room she entered. She still used professional and precise language for as long as she could, before the honest thing forced its way through. She still moved through space with the specific economy of someone who had trained herself to waste nothing, and she still wore the dark suits, and the watch, and the pin from her father, and when she was uncertain, her jaw set in the way it set, and her shoulder tightened a fraction, and the cost of whatever she was holding showed at the edges in the way that only people who were paying careful attention could see. I was paying careful attention. The drawer was open. It had been open since June, since the marble floor, since "Get up, I've got you." And what was in it no longer required management. Neither of us had to say "I love you" for it to be completely true. But she said it eventually in the kitchen of my apartment on a Tuesday morning in November, with the plant in the window, and the good southern light, and the black Americano double shot on the counter she had brought up from the coffee shop on the corner. Said it in the specific Vesper way, which was without fanfare and with complete precision, in the middle of a sentence about a development project that had nothing to do with it, as if the sentence were merely the container the words had found themselves inside. I said, "I know. I love you too." She said, "You already knew." I said, "For a while." She said, "How long?" I said, "Long enough that the drawer needed reorganizing." She looked at me. The full version. The completely open, completely unmanaged version of the attention she brought to the things she considered most worth attending to. She said, "Good." One word, the specific good that meant, "This is correct, this is what I was accounting for, this is exactly what it was supposed to be." It was, as it turned out, exactly that.